just want to begin by welcoming everyone to the final and very special instalment in our lecture series, Conter versus Corona, as well as the global public health emergency. COVID-19 has created deep economic, political and social crises, and Conter has organised a series of talks to explore these issues in depth. Since lockdown began, we have had lectures on the economy, on globalisation, on imperialism, on class, oppression, and how the left should organise to win power. And to finish and give a grand finale to that lecture series, tonight we're very lucky to have Tariq Ali with us. So before I introduce Tariq, I'm going to run you through a few things to make sure that everybody gets to hear the message from tonight. So firstly, I'll be your chair or facilitator. My name is Kat Boyd. I'm a member of the Conter editorial board. I'm one of the co-founders of Radical Independence. And I also host I want to say twice weekly podcast with David Jameson, who's also the editor of Conter. But I'll be honest, we've been a bit slow during lockdown. So for any of our subscribers who are in on the call tonight, then apologies. But we do have a new one out today. So I co-host the podcast Contercast with David Jameson. So if you've been to any of our message that Tariq is going to share with us tonight. So rather than doing breakout groups, we are going to have a question and answer session. Now, these questions have been submitted in advance. We've asked for questions to come in from our social media channels. We also have a public WhatsApp group. So anyone who's been to our lectures has been provided a link that they can join the WhatsApp group. And that connects you to other like-minded people who've come along to the lecture series. The link to join that, if you've not joined already, is in the same email you would have received with the link for tonight's meeting. So if you do want to join the WhatsApp group, you can go into your emails really quick on your phone and hit join the WhatsApp group, and that'll set you up into the Conter WhatsApp chat. I can already see there's a bit of chatter in it tonight already. So the structure of tonight's meeting is going to be Tariq speaking for around 30 to 40 minutes. And then we'll have a quick message from Jonathan Shafi, who's also from the Conter editorial board. And he's just going to touch upon what the work Conter is doing, bit of fundraising, not going to lie, we will be doing some fundraising tonight because we think that these lectures have been really enjoyable. The feedback we've had has been great, but we really do need some donations in order to build the project and keep the project going. So a few housekeeping details just before we start. We ask that your microphone is on mute at all times. This isn't because what you have to say or what you think isn't important. It is. If you join the WhatsApp group, if you go into that email, click the link, join the WhatsApp group, you can ask questions through there, you can tell us what you think. The reason we ask you to keep your microphone on mute is so that everybody can hear what's being said by our contributor tonight. It just cuts down on the problem of feedback, and it means everybody has a better experience. Also, this was all new to me when we started lockdown and everyone was doing online meetings. Some of you might have heard about people disrupting Zoom meetings. Now, we've taken a number of precautions to prevent this, and we have a security team, a light touch security team on hand to make sure that this meeting is not disrupted. So that brings me to introducing tonight's lecture. And actually, it's a real privilege to introduce tonight's lecture. So I hope you're all ready and tuned in for what's going to be a really great event. So capitalism used to legitimize itself as a democratic way of life. However, a generation of triumphant neoliberalism left a very different legacy a scarring democratic deficit, which we're all too aware of in Scotland, economic decline, and the rise of authoritarian populism. Donald Trump might be the most obvious sign of system failure, but no country has escaped. And leftist responses have been consistently confused. If we're being honest with ourselves, leftist responses have been confused, and that is illustrated greatly in the whole Brexit debacle. In this lecture, we've got one of the world's leading public intellectuals to address the future of democracy under capitalism. So Tariq Ali is a long-standing advocate of Scottish independence. I've met Tariq before as he's addressed our Radical Independence Conference a couple of times and come up to Scotland and done meetings with us. And he's going to discuss the global context for our thinking about popular sovereignty. Tariq Ali rose to global prominence with his role in resisting the Vietnam War. As a leader of the global New Left, he befriended the likes of Malcolm X, John Lennon, Yoko Ono. Since the 60s, he has remained at the forefront of leftist thinking in a variety of capacities. He is the editor of New Left Review and author of dozens of books, including The Extreme Centre, A Warning. So Tariq, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pass over to you. The floor is now yours, half an hour to 40 minutes, and then we'll hear from Jonathan Shafi.
Thank you very much, Kat, and all the other comrades who've gathered there, who are very familiar to me from the days of the Radical Independence campaign. I'd like to start by making 3 points and then expanding on them. First, when I wrote The Extreme Centre, a warning, quite a few people were skeptical. And assumed that effectively I was being too ultra-left, going over the top, capitalism was in trouble, but things weren't as bad as I made them out to be. The points I made in the Extreme Centre were very basic, which was that politics is now so determined and so dominated by capitalism and economics that it has become what Lenin once referred to it as, that politics is little more, he meant bourgeois politics, mainstream politics, is little more than concentrated economics. We can see that now with virtually every major and not so major capitalist countries not daring to do anything political, the mainstream parties, without checking it out first with their financial backers, with the oligarchs who run huge corporations in their countries, etc. This is the situation in most of the major capitalist states. China is slightly different because it is still run by the heirs of the Chinese Communist Party, who made the revolution in 1949. And so private capitalism in China is still under some constraints, which is one reason why the Chinese have done so well. And so the Extreme Centre argued that centre-left and centre-right parties had effectively become one party, i.e. what was the American system was now spreading through Europe and other parts of the world, and that this was in fact creating a very hollow democracy in which all the rituals were preserved, but all the things that were considered positive about democracy 40, 50 years ago, more debates, more diversity, more discussion, more challenging of the existing social, political, and economic orders, that has all gone. It's gone. Which is why, allow me a footnote, I find it rather amusing that the attacks being made on the movement, social movements today, in particular Black Lives Matter, saying you're stopping people from expressing their views and accusing the movement of being censorious and imposing its own censorship. Now, the fact is that it has not been the case for a very long time, if ever, that movements like Black Lives Matter, the Occupy movements, actually have been given fair coverage, regular space in the mainstream media. You can go right back. That has never happened. So the notion that these movements who are just demanding something extra to air their views and demanding and saying that some of the views being exercised they find disagreeable and offensive, they're the ones being attacked. And the defenders of so-called freedom of speech are people who've never allowed the movements from having their own voice. So that is quite entertaining, really, and quite cheeky of these people, including neocons who are now coming up with this argument, and liberal voices which should know better, but then they've been part of the problem. So the argument was very straightforward, and we are now seeing it in action. We saw it already in action to a certain extent in 2008, but the COVID crisis, the spread of the virus, has shown the complete incapacity of global capitalism as it functions today of solving any serious problems. I mean, the figures just provided by Robert Brenner in California at the UCLA, leading economic historian, are quite staggering and unanswerable. Bob argues that effectively, I will just quote, that the Fed in the United States has put $7.1 trillion of wealth in the hands of equity investors. 4.5 trillion has gone to the country's largest and best of companies. This, in many cases, is taxpayers' money being paid by ordinary people who are not being helped. The only interesting thing in this deal, which was pushed through by both the Democrats and the Republicans, first by the Republicans in the Senate, and then by the Democrats in the House of Representatives, and only one person voted against it in the House, and that was AOC. Cortez, because she comes from the Bronx and Queens and areas which have really suffered because of the COVID crisis. She could not vote for it. She did not accept the argument of her own party. And unfortunately, it has to be said that though Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren argued against some of the measures being taken, and the large amounts of money given to people who are already looting the country to loot it some more, when it came to the crunch, they didn't vote against it. So this shows the extent to which capitalist ideology has gripped parliamentarians, even the most ultra-liberal, or people like Bernie who call themselves socialists. I mean, I was very supportive of him and still am. But once you give up your fight to get the nomination, it doesn't mean you stop being the opposition. You have to carry on. So what we are witnessing in the United States today is trillions being given to people who are already billionaires in many cases. I mean, the Jeff Bezos, his wealth has increased by $34.6 billion. Mark Zuckerberg has just made, thanks to this bailout so-called, another $25 billion. And if anything exposes the corruptions, the permanent corruptions of capital and its votaries, it is how the COVID is being organized in many parts of the world, that the rich are being made richer, people who are suffering from the lowest rung of the ladder, or you can go up several rungs of the ladder, they're all suffering, are in fact being given nothing. In some countries, not here I'm not talking about the United States. People are being allowed to die, and their leaders are saying, well, people die. So what? The poor always die because there's malnutrition. They don't ask who has created the malnutrition. Why should the poor suffer? Why should they die? This government in Britain is blaming caregivers for the disaster of the care homes, where they sent the elderly for many, many years now, and which was not changed by Labour when it came to power, and carried on, actually. The whole process of privatizing these homes carried on. It's fine to blame those who own these homes, but you have to understand, which world do you live in? The reason these people wanted to buy the care homes was not to look after the elderly, but to make money. This doesn't mean that all the people they employed had the same mentality, because most of them were poor on low wages. But the proprietors of these care homes are to blame, as is the government, which gave them these opportunities. So if anything has brought to the fore the way in which capital functions and the way in which it will carry on functioning till we get rid of it in some shape or form, is very clearly linked to the lack of democracy, to the lack of alternatives in the areas where immediately after the Second World War, there were parties with political differences. Where political differences arise, or begin to arise, the party leaders who want to make certain shifts in more positive, more progressive directions are vilified, attacked, and driven out of the leadership of their parties by a combination of things. I mean, the way in which Jeremy Corbyn was removed effectively by the media, backed by his own parliamentary party, or the bulk of it, backed by the Conservative Party. He was too radical, he was crazy, he was nutty. The Tory press carried on like this. Had it only been the Conservative press, none of us would have been surprised. But the line of The Guardian, the voice of English liberalism, was no different. Bit more, tiny bit less virulent, but it published some of the most atrocious trash I've seen in recent years against the leader of the Labour Party, the official opposition party. And then they added to that, The Guardian in particular, but also everyone else in the mainstream parties, the charge that Corbyn was an anti-Semite. I'm stressing this to show how capitalism functions and how it actually curtails the functioning of democracy. Add to this, you know, one of the sort of big glib phrases of pro-Western defenders of the system is that it's the West which has done everything, and you know, democracy is our achievement. We discovered it first, and so it's as if democratic functioning existed from Plato to NATO. That from ancient Greece to the EU, where membership of NATO is now compulsory, and you have to show good faith in fighting wars or paying for them or helping to arm the countries fighting them on behalf of the United States. The notion that this has anything to do with democracy is a complete joke. So on three levels: the political level, primarily the economic level, and on what is called the security matters level. And the security matters level is very straightforward. It's essentially that the EU and NATO will do what the United States wants. And if there's serious trouble at home, in the countries backing these wars, the Americans can give you saying, okay, we know you're facing a few problems, don't fight these wars. The fact that the SNP decided to go in and back NATO, having not done so, demoralize many of its own supporters inside the party, and the others just capitulated, as they did when Blair took over the Labour Party, and his supporters completely controlled everything in that party for nearly 25 years, if not more. I mean, they still do in a way. They don't control it, but they have a large force in it. And if you know, as I always do at the radical conferences, radical independence conferences in Scotland, the SNP has now become a problem. It is repeating the processes which we've already witnessed on a lesser scale, because Scotland is not as large as these big economies, of what has been going on in Britain, in England, and what has been going on in most of the EU countries. I mean, to be uncritical of the European Union these days is really foolish, because you can see how it functions. It has been, as I've argued for a long time, the engine for capitalism today. And there's no point in calling it neoliberal capitalism, because there ain't any other form of capitalism. By trying to, this has become quite popular, and it's difficult to challenge by individuals, but I think the word neoliberal should be dropped. It is capitalism. Capitalism has functioned like this before. It stopped for a limited period from 1945 to 1978-79, because it felt at that time that unless certain structures were put into place and the state played its role in creating something positive, in even taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor via progressive taxation, there would be explosions. And there was always the existence of the Soviet Union and that part of the world, and they felt threatened by it. So they made concessions, and they will make other concessions if they have to. But at the moment, they don't think they have to. So what is the origins of the system, the capitalist socio-economic system, has very little to do with democracy. In fact, for most of its life, capitalism has functioned without any democracy at all. Then, for a second phase in its life, it functioned as a democracy, but denied the vote to half the population, women. So if we're being serious in trying to explain the links between capitalism and democracy, we have to say that democracy, as it is understood today, a universal suffrage, only came into existence after the First World War, and then too gradually. In the 30s, prior to that, there used to be property franchises. Working class people couldn't vote, even though they had struggled for the vote. The struggles of the Chartists were struggles for the vote. In the United States, as in ancient Greece, slaves weren't allowed to vote. People find this shocking when I sometimes say, but it's a fact. Slaves weren't allowed to vote in ancient Greece. And, centuries later, when the American Constitution was framed and brought into existence, as many of the Black Lives Matter leaders and others have been insisting on over the last few months, the slaveholders, it was a slaveholders' democracy, which is why there is a great deal of anger against the founding fathers. I mean, we all knew this, it wasn't a secret, but somehow it was nice to, brush it aside, to whitewash it, so to speak. That is now no longer possible, but it not being possible, it doesn't mean that anything substantial will change unless there is an upheaval of cataclysmic proportions in the Western world and elsewhere. The other thing about democracy, it's worth saying, is that the most successful capitalism today is being carried out by a country, China, in which there's been hardly any democratic traditions at all for centuries, thousands of years, for millennia. It's one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And when it decided to go this route, the capitalist route, they did so, I mean, very systematically under the control of the party, but without any democracy. And no one could challenge that. So there are no links, genetic links, if you like, between democracy and capitalism as such. And as I suggested earlier, what we are witnessing now is the use of this very rapacious looters capitalism, predatory capitalism, to further control democracy and make it meaningless. And many of the movements that erupt are aware of this, which is why they don't go near political parties. I mean, to be honest, we all know the problems with Trump. That's hardly a secret. The liberal press has talked about nothing else, and it's largely true. He is a eccentric, slightly nutty billionaire who became president when he thought he wouldn't. He thought it'd be just one thing worth trying to become president, and he was quite surprised when he became it, and then he started saying weird things. And it's brought America's standing in the world, which is what concerns them, right down. What they don't understand is that their standing in the world has been right down for a long, long period. If you don't count the world simply as Western Europe, or today as the European Union. Just one point, another point I would like to stress, which is this. This COVID-19 epidemic became a huge thing, largely because it affected the Western world. There have been pandemics before, as most of you know, which have gripped Asia, which have gripped Africa. There's never been any serious continuing coverage of it. It's when it hits you, when it hits the West itself, that it becomes an issue. And there is no guarantee that these pandemics are going to be brought to a stop unless there is systemic change. I mean, the fact that in the United States, the hospitals collapsed, couldn't deal with it, the figures are astronomical of the numbers of people dying, is not a big surprise. These hospitals are built, maintained as corporate entities to care largely for the rich and for people who can afford to pay. There is no universal coverage. At the very least, America's political class could have used the pandemic, because 70% of the population now wants a nationalized or national health service. They didn't do that. They didn't do that because they are completely in hock to the big billionaires, as we've seen, and the money that they've been doling out. So it's a bad situation. And then the other thing we saw, for all those who see the EU as the gold standard, was how the EU functioned when the pandemic broke. Suddenly all talk of a union disappeared in the practice of what happened. Each country for itself. The Italians are the ones who were deeply shocked, because despite all their pleas to the Germans, or the German banks indirectly, please help us, we're really going under, they got no help at all. Help even on the dealing with the pandemic front came from the Chinese and from Cuban doctors. The doctors from a tiny socialist island coming to Western Europe to help a country as large as Italy and as important to the European Union as it is. So Europe could not function as a union. It was each country for itself. And that's what it will be in any crisis. So blind support for Europe is just not worth it. It's wrong. Even those who support going into the European Union, if Scotland ever becomes independent, have to be very careful on this front. They have to demand changes, basic structural reforms, including democratic reforms of this institution. And it's these institutions, following the United States, that have brought the world, large parts of the world, into a situation that is desperate. If you look at Palestine, is what the Israelis are doing to it. This absurd campaign against Corbyn has scared off people from supporting Palestinians. Oh, are we anti-Semitic? No, you're not. You never were. In most cases, the levels of anti-Semitism in Britain are the lowest in the Western world. So it's affected that. Scotland in particular used to be very strongly pro-Palestine. I remember a young SNP member of parliament arriving with a Palestinian flag on her way at Heathrow Airport, on her way to take her seat in the House of Commons. The Irish have remained like that. In Scotland too, I think that there's been some decline. So these are the problems that we have to consider. And while the movements are great and have to be supported whenever they erupt on their own, they do not lead to systemic changes, which is what are needed. The idea of reforming capitalism, which some people are coming up with, quite honestly is ridiculous. I mean, who is going to reform capitalism? The current level of politicians and oligarchs who run the world? I don't think so. I'll stop there so people can ask their question.
Thank you so much for that, Tariq. That was really great, really interesting. I'm sure everyone will join me in giving Tariq a virtual round of applause. There are the reaction buttons on Zoom, or old-fashioned, just clap into the camera. Welcome to the new normal. So thank you very much for that. Now, before I begin to ask the questions that have been submitted, which Tariq, I've tried to group the questions around particular themes, because obviously there's crossover points and things like that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in Jonathan Shafi from the Conter editorial board to do a little pitch for your support. I just want to also update people that as well as the 120 plus people in this Zoom call, we've got well over 100 who are watching thanks to our friends at Independence Live who are streaming the event for us tonight. So I'm going to just unmute Jonathan Shafi if you want to come in and ask for money, I guess.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kat, and Tariq as well. I suppose where Tariq ended is where I'll pick up, and that's on the need for there to be a really serious critique of capitalism, and one which can be met with action. We know that the various uprisings that we're seeing just now take place across the world have a real strength to them. They come from below, they are challenging in many ways the system, but at the same time as that, we need to have as many outlets as we can who are putting forward a coherent and a positive anti-capitalist case to the movements and to the public in general. Now, since the start of the coronavirus and the lockdown, the Conter team, and there is a very good team of people behind all of this work, have been running lectures every week. And I've been doing a bit of calculations, and we've reached over 2,000 individuals who have taken part in some way or another in those lectures. Now, that actually is quite something, because it means that thousands of people have been able to hear an analysis, have been able to engage with a discussion in terms of how we can overcome the barriers to change that are presented by the system, by the state, and so on. There's one in particular, and I'm not going to speak for long, but there's one in particular that I wanted to raise with people just to show you, I think, the importance of a project like Conter. And it was during the high point of the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. And we had a link up and an event with activists in Minneapolis. And it was, I think, quite inspiring to hear, in particular, from one of the speakers who happened to be a member of the bus workers union. And he told the story of how he went into his workplace. He argued with his colleagues, with his workmates, that the buses which they drive on a daily basis should not be used to transport protesters to jails after they'd been arrested on the streets during the protest. Now, that one story has managed to get through to lots of trade unionists in Scotland, lots of people who are active in the movement in Scotland. One of the most important things that we can do is to generalise the best experiences of working class resistance, the best experiences of those who are in the thick of the struggle and who are making, I think, important tactical and strategic decisions which actually lead to a wider sense of confidence in the movements that are challenging the system. And I think that one example shows what Conter can do. In Scotland, I think there has been a dearth of Marxist analysis, of anti-capitalist output, and Conter, while embryonic, is an attempt to do that and do it in a way which isn't abstract. It's not about sitting about and reading Marx and reading Lenin and not putting it into practice. It's about, as I say, generalising the best examples that we can find. And we think that we can strengthen the movement by doing that. In the last week as well, people may have seen it, but George Kerevan, who is a former SNP MP, an economist, and also a member of the Conter editorial board, wrote a very important article, I think the most important article, and I don't say that lightly, about the SNP, the modern SNP since 2014. And it's not just me that's saying that. That's been said by many of the most influential commentators, pundits and activists inside the independence movement. And that article is a description, an analysis, and it is putting forward a framework for understanding the SNP at the crossroads, where support for independence is going up, but action to deliver independence, shall we say, is being paralysed. And that runs alongside the more generally neoliberal approach that the SNP are taking when it comes to tenants, when it comes to the economy writ large, and when it comes indeed to the recovery that we hope to see after COVID. We hope to see it in a progressive direction, and to do that, we're going to need to have organisations who are willing to stand up and to say that the SNP, despite being popular, need to be challenged on these fronts. I will also just say lastly as well that one of the really impressive initiatives that have taken place throughout the lockdown is a series of worker stories. The Worker Stories project, which is part of the Conter effort, has been a place where there's a direct reflection of the working class experience of the virus and of the impact of the lockdown economically, socially, politically, and all the rest of it, directly from workers. And so what we're doing with this project is to bring that experience, to give it a platform that cannot be found in the mainstream media and indeed in any of the mainstream political parties. So that, I hope, is a very quick but hopefully quite educational overview of what we think Conter is doing well. We know that we have a lot more to do, but we are funded by very few people, and we're just at the start of this project. So what I'm going to do now, very briefly before we go on to the questions, because I know that is the primary thing people want to hear about, but I'm going to share my screen at the present moment, and you will see a new part of our website, which has just been set up. Now, this will allow us to take in funds. It will allow you, if you believe that our work is of value going forward, allow you to become a supporter and to take out a monthly donation. If you go to conter.co.uk/support-Conter, we'll put that round in an email to you after this meeting. You'll be presented with this page here, and I'll do my best QVC at this present time. You click on supporter, and you will be taken through the various menus that you'll need to fill out. But what I will say is this is extremely simple to do. We've went to find the most streamlined, efficient and simplest possible means that we can allow you to support our work, and that's how you do it right there. Your name, email, all your banking details and postcode, and that's how you've set up the direct debit. Look, I'll just end by saying in closing, when it comes to this pitch, and while I do so, I'll stop sharing as well, is just to say that this is just the start of a project. We believe that there is a real need for this to be in existence in Scotland, for this kind of analysis at the moment to be readily available and to becoming increasingly popular. And I think there's a very important reason why, which is that if you look at the decline of democracy, specifically within the context of the UK state, then we know that Scotland is going to be in a position, the movement in Scotland, in a position where we can make a direct challenge to Boris Johnson, to the British state. In doing so, we can help our comrades in England and elsewhere in the United Kingdom. But we will better able to do that if we have something like Conter that can get out the kind of analysis that Tariq's given, that George has given this week, the kind of analysis that brings the real experiences of workers to the fore, and lastly, the kind of experience that we've reflected in these online meetings with that bus worker who went into his workplace and said, we're not going to transport these protesters to the jails. We want to generalise the best experience, and we can only do that with your help. So please do, if you can, make a donation to Conter this evening, and tell all of your contacts and networks to do the same as well. And with that, I will pass back to Kat to continue the rest of the meeting.
Thanks, Jonathan. You've certainly convinced me. I've even written on my hand to remind myself to set that up. So thanks very much for that. What we'll do now is we'll move on to that all-important Q&A part with Tariq. So I've tried my best during the lecture to multitask and listen to what's being said, and also to group those questions that have come in so that there's a bit of continuity to what's being asked. So Tariq, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you the first three questions kind of in one go, if that's all right, because they're related to Scotland and the SNP. So I know you've done like a global picture, but there's a lot of questions that have come in. For the people who are listening, or if you're streaming in on Indy Live, and you did ask a question related to this topic, then what I've done is I've probably tried to build it in so that we can keep it, get the answers that we want to hear. So firstly, from Lisa, we got a question saying the SNP became a mass party of the working class out of a working class mass movement, but has now become the most centralised and undemocratic party in Europe. How can the movement exert some control? How do we stop career politicians from undermining party democracy? We have a question from Grant in our WhatsApp group, which is, given the SNP's position within the extreme centre and its hegemonic position in Scotland, is the concept of a, quote, big tent independence movement over? And what does that mean for the likes of radical independence? And lastly, a question that's come in from one of our viewers on Facebook. And I love this question. I can't wait to hear what you've got to say about this, Tariq. It's from Ali, and he says, can, or maybe that's, should Scotland hold a referendum on independence without the permission of Westminster? So that's our three questions on the topic of Scotland and the SNP, and I'll pass over to you now, Tariq.
Okay, as far as the SNP is concerned, there has been a big shift. I mean, George Caravan's article points out the shift historically from when the SNP was formed to now. I think the closer Nicola Sturgeon thinks she's going to get to power and becoming an independent state, the more to the right she will go, to show that she's acceptable, she's part of the European consensus, that there's nothing to worry about, because there might be some objection to Scotland becoming a member of the EU. From it, all it requires is one state to veto, and that's that. So I think that is one of the reasons the SNP is moving to the right. whether it's the worst and most bureaucratized organization in Europe, I would doubt, to be perfectly frank. There are many others in a much higher position, exalted position. I mean, Macron's party in France is a complete and utter joke. And he rules that country in an iron grip. It's totally run by the state bureaucracy, with Macron giving direct orders. Parliament is, in any case, under the Fifth Republic, not regarded as very important, but under Macron it has got even worse. Number of Eastern European countries, Hungary, Poland, not much better. So there's a lot to choose from as to which particularly deformed, bureaucratized party you compare it to. The SNP hasn't got there yet, and let's hope it never does. The question about whether Scottish independence, I think if I got the question right, whether Scottish independence will help people, the radical left and progressives in England, my answer is yes. It already has done so. I have written this in the past, but I don't believe that the young people in England would have rallied to Corbyn, stormed the Labour Party, joined in hundreds of thousands and elected Corbyn leader, had it not been for the independence campaign in Scotland, which they observed, which they saw, which their friends talked about, in which young people were debating, arguing, etc. on the streets. So in independent Scotland, even, if the SNP leads it, at the moment one can't see any other alternative. But if there is a campaign for independence, that can be a much, much more radical campaign that the SNP would envisage, unless they want to bring the police out to prevent this, which would be very foolish. I think the campaign itself could be radical and will have an impact in this country. We'll see how many members Labour has got left by that time, because there are people flooding out of the party too. Of course, half of Corbyn supporters voted for Keir Starmer, but I think some of them are realizing what's happening. The third question, should Scotland go for a referendum without Westminster's approval? Well, I would support that, because it would be a huge moral victory if the opinion polls are right, which would then make a proper referendum unavoidable, unless the Conservative government decides to do what the Spanish have done in relation to Catalonia, where when the Catalans held this referendum, the very act of holding it was considered illegal, and the leaders of pretty moderate mainstream Catalan parties, as well as the radicals, have been in prison. Some of them are still in prison, and the European Union hasn't done a thing to support the Catalans. So be warned. It can be done. It depends how it's done. I mean, you remember before Scotland was even guaranteed the limited rights it has, there was a whole campaign from below. At that time, the SNP was a much more progressive force. And I have to say that, echoing what George said, my own feeling about the way in which Alex Salmond was dumped, with all his weaknesses, he was a much better leader for Scotland than they've got at the moment. The couple currently running the country, I think, are on the path, in political terms, to move even further to the right. I remember speaking with Alex Salmond at the big anti-Iraq war demonstration, where we had 1 million people in London. He was the only party leader from Parliament who came and spoke with us and made a very powerful speech against that war, for which they'd never quite forgiven him. That and other things too led to this campaign against him. I don't want to comment on the particulars of the charges in court, but he was acquitted by a jury which had a majority of women on it. So I don't know. And he's, no doubt done things which none of us would like. But as a politician and a political leader, he was much, much more effective than today. So how an independence referendum is carried out without Westminster has to be very carefully thought about and then seen, what happens.
Great, thanks. I mean, I couldn't agree more with your point about the young people who elected Corbyn for leader in Labour. Actually, the politics that we had, those of us who were involved in radical independence, that we had in common with them was, I think, very evident. I remember back in 2012 when we were talking anti-war, anti-nuclear, anti-Trident rather, anti-austerity, people thought we were mad. Then fast forward a couple of years and Corbyn's in charge, and I don't doubt that the radical politics of Scotland had a significant impact on that. And so the next group of questions, Tariq, that we have are around left populism, the establishment, and also the Labour Party. So one that's come in from Margaret is, left populism seemed to offer some hope for reviving democracy, but Syriza, Podemos, and even Corbyn ended up co-opted by the establishment. What lessons can we learn? From Edward, we have, as you touched upon, that many Corbyn supporters have left the Labour Party as it has moved back to the right under Starmer. Many are currently feeling politically homeless. Many would join a new, genuinely socialist party, especially if Corbyn and or other socialist campaign group MPs were part of it. Why is this so unlikely to happen? And finally, from Bill, the extreme centre suffered major losses after 2008. With the rise of Starmer, Biden and Sturgeon, is the extreme centre making a comeback?
Okay, firstly on populism, look, it's not a word I particularly like. It is used quite stupidly to explain what politics is these days. So right-wing populism is actually a code word for semi-fascist, reactionary organizations which have sprung up all over Europe and in South America. Bolsonaro being the symbol of it in the largest country in South America, Brazil. Why should we call them populists? There's nothing much to do with it. I mean, populism was a word used in the 40s and 50s for some in Latin America who basically played a in-between role between the left and the right, but used their personal charisma and standing in order to win support and push through reforms. I mean, Perón in Argentina was a genuine populist, which is also why he got removed. But what Peronism created was a staunch and strong trade union movement, which still exists. The Peronist movement has its strength in the working class because of all the reforms that were pushed through then. I mean, you could have called him a left reformist, but the word populism was used largely by his critics from the left who didn't want to be identified with him for a variety of other reasons. So I think in the case of Corbyn and others, Sanders, for instance, the word to use is not populism so much as left social democrats. Corbyn himself uses the word radical social democracy, which I think is pretty accurate. But given that social democracy itself, historically, has been under attack and has capitulated most cravenly from the Blair period onwards, it is important to signify that what some of these people are trying to do in South America and here, and being toppled for it in South America, or being, laid on, being put under siege, and what was done to Corbyn is because of that social democracy. Now, I don't accept that Corbyn. I don't agree with. I think the reason Labour lost the election, it's not that Corbyn was co-opted. In fact, if he had been co-opted, they probably wouldn't have chucked him out. He refused to be co-opted on the most of the fundamental issues, especially on foreign policy. And that makes the British very nervous. When you have an English general who is running the British Army, going on breakfast time television and saying if Corbyn is elected Prime Minister, there will be mutinies in the army, you know how worried the secret state is. They did everything possible to get rid of him, and we shouldn't forget that. I think he made a big mistake in not fighting back against the Zionists in British political life. He should have done. My own information is he was in a minority within the left. I think on the referendum issue, he was completely outvoted by the left in his own circles. Just think about it. There has been a referendum, whether you like it or not. The majority have voted, and it's not an insignificant size, to get out of the European Union. And a opposition political party spends all its time, after coming close to winning the first election, which he participated in, but the second period comes close to demanding a second referendum because they didn't like the first one, and finding ways to sabotage it. It was complete sabotage, and it was seen as such. And socialists who were campaigning and canvassing in the north of England said, even many Remain supporters said to them, we have to say we are not happy in the way in which the London folk are trying to say that our votes don't matter. Even though we lost, it's not a nice feeling. And Johnson outplayed them and outflanked them. And for them now, who are in power, the Remainer elite, are now leading the Labour Party. For them not to recognize this fact, I think is deeply shocking. To the other question, will there be a new party? Look, this is an old problem. In a system, political system, where you don't have proportional representation, the Labour Party exercises a monopoly hold on popular working class representation, or used to, till this election where a majority of working people voted Tory. That's just a fact. You can't get away from that. The traditional base of the Labour Party, voted Conservative and helped elect a Conservative government, a right-wing Conservative government with a fairly large majority. So it's difficult to topple it. Whether Labour will make it difficult for these people, the left, to stay in the Labour Party, who knows? At the moment, they're expelling and have been expelling the hardcore in the Labour Party, anyone who challenges their line on Israel or Zionism, etc. Will they expand this? The only way the 30 Socialist Campaign Group MPs, including Corbyn himself, would leave the Labour Party is if they're expelled. And I don't think that's going to happen. I remember once asking Tony Benn, we were speaking together, and before the meeting we were talking, and I said, Tony, are there any circumstances in which you would leave the Labour Party? He said, no. I said, what if Labour were to join in a nuclear attack on our country with the United States? He said, oh, well, we'd stop it. But I said, no, you wouldn't be able to stop it. But I said, it's really, in my opinion, wrong of you to say no, because this party, of which you've been a loyal member, is capable of doing a lot of very bad things and has done them in the past. But there is this loyalty to it's a tribal loyalty, really. or as you support a football team, which the left has been part of. So I'm not at all sure that a new party is possible. Obviously, if 100,000 people, young people, decided to create a new party, a socialist, broadly speaking, non-sectarian socialist party, it would have an impact, not electorally, but in the culture, the political culture, and society as a whole. I mean, I, for one, would join it, you know. I supported Corbyn. I never joined the Labour Party, but I think, but it's not likely to happen immediately. The way things go, if, you know, people will wait for the next election, if Keir Starmer, who I've named Steer Karma, if Steer Karma calms down the electorate and actually wins, people will be relieved and say, oh, at last we've got rid of the Tories. How many times in my life have I seen people going through this process? So barring unforeseen things, this is unlikely to happen. I really wish I could say the opposite, but I can't.
Thanks very much for those responses. What was it you called Keir Starmer? Steer Kammer. I like that. I think I'll use that myself. The next round of questions I've grouped under empire and racism. So we have 3 questions here. We have a question from Shruti that came in on our WhatsApp group. She's a research student from India. Now that Kashmir has been hailed by the right-wing BJP party as supposedly finally part of India, how does one make the case for freedom of Kashmir now when both guns and guitar haven't added up as an effective dissent or resistance? And we have a question about Black Lives Matter, which is termed in this question as the first mass social movement of the coronavirus era. Economies are in crisis, mass redundancies and employment will follow, and working people will face wage cuts. How do we connect the energy of Black Lives Matter, making clearer connections with the reality of racism being a class issue in our own current context? And that's from Hugh. And lastly, in this group, we have a question from Brian, which is, given deepening inequality and division, it appears a monumental task to build effective class-based dialogue and action that confronts both empire and capitalism. Where should we begin?
Okay. On the situation in Kashmir, Kashmir has been in lockdown long before the virus. They actually locked the province down. They cut off all links to it. I had Kashmiri friends here and elsewhere in the world, talking to me, pleading with me to help and do something. One does what one can, but they cut off all communication. So Facebook, phone, mobile phones, everything was stopped. So the people of Kashmir couldn't talk about what was being done to them to anyone outside. And I think the world stood by and watched effectively. I mean, just imagine, had India been governed by a left-wing government and done that, or had China done, I mean, just look, China hasn't done half or even a quarter of that as far as Hong Kong is concerned. They've passed a security law, which means they could if they wanted. They haven't done it. But the hostility, the attacks, many of them justified, by the way, just compare that to the attitude taken by the bulk of the media, the government of this country and other countries, the United States in particular, the opposition. I mean, Steer Karma's first remarks on Kashmir were utterly appalling. Then I think he met a few people and he had to change things. What the Indians have done is to remove the special status that the Indian constitution had guaranteed Kashmir because Kashmir was a contested area when the subcontinent was split up by the departing British Empire in 1947. The Indian government was aware of this, that there was a huge 90% majority of Muslims in that area, and keeping it by force was not tenable. So the Indian government agreed that there would be a referendum in Kashmir where people would be able to decide whether they're for India or for Pakistan. In later years, many Kashmiri activists said, we want a third option, independence. But whether they would have got that, but at the moment, nothing. All those promises, all the UN resolutions in favor of a referendum have been ended by the Modi government, which, to be totally frank, it is very close to a fascist government. In the way it operates, it's very clever, it's not stupid. In the way it mobilizes people, in the way it is crushing opposition, rewriting the textbooks, leave alone Kashmir. In India as a whole, there have been pogroms of Muslims. Muslims are being attacked in many parts of India, and some brave people like Arundhati Roy and brave others have attacked all this. But from mainstream India, there's been very little. From the, as far as Kashmir is concerned, the position, I would say, of virtually all the parties, with the limited exception of the Communist Party, though their position hasn't been great because they're scared of being tarred with the brush of anti-Indian, have been appalling. All this, some of the worst atrocities in Kashmir took place under the Congress government, it has to be said. So the fact that Modi is using that, saying, okay, let's solve this problem, it's the final solution of the Kashmiri people, by ending all their special status, Indian businesses will be able to go over and create more jobs, etc. My mass migration to Kashmir, it's one of the most beautiful parts of the world, and certainly in India. Is a real outrage. So we fight against it as best we can, but people in India itself, including Indian Muslims, are scared. Look, the bulk of the most popular film stars in Bollywood, the Indian cinema industry, are Muslims, are of Muslim origins. I don't want to name people because I know quite a few of them, but they're scared to say anything. That's one thing. Don't say it if you're that scared. But basically, one reason some of them are scared is because they are billionaires. They're hugely popular. It's something you can't imagine here, but you can in the United States with some big Hollywood stars. They're hugely successful. They're billionaires, and they've broken the law. They've not paid taxes. They've bribed people to get land, to circumvent planning laws, to build their places. So the government has got its hands on their throats, saying, okay, you want to support the Kashmiris, you'll be locked up because we've got a list of everything you've done. The government doesn't even have to say that, they know that. So it's the tragedy of Kashmir is not just what's happening to Kashmir itself, but what the lack of support they're getting from citizens in India. And so Kashmiri populations in this country, in the United States, have to get their act together. And basically, sucking up to local politicians isn't the way to do it. They're not going to do anything that goes against what they regard as the interests of the West. And the interests of the West are to keep Modi in power because they see him as a tough-minded leader and use him against China. And that is what they're doing. And Modi is very happy to be used, both against China and against Pakistan. And in Kashmir, I don't know how many people know this, but for years, Modi has brought in Israeli defense specialists and advisors to help them in how to completely destroy the opposition in Kashmir. Now, if I was a Labour Party member and said that, this would be regarded as a conspiracy theory. It's a fact. This has happened. We know it. It's been published. It's been admitted by the Indian officials and by the Israelis. Don't deny it. Why should they? I mean, they're helping a big country. So that is what's going on. So the scale of it is horrendous, and whether they succeed or not, we shall see. I mean, at the moment, it looks as if though they might. It depends on the scale of the opposition that develops in Kashmir itself. The second question was on racism being a class issue. I know we always say that, but unfortunately, it hasn't been for a long, long time, if ever. And I'll tell you why. Because all the countries that were empires, the European empires, sorry. I'm sorry about that. Have you got me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Don't worry about it.
Okay. The history of empires, European empires in particular, has been one where these empires and what they gained from them went very deep into the labor movements and the working class movements in all these countries. In Britain, whether we like it or not, large numbers of workers supported the British Empire. Scotland, as you know, played an appalling role. The one reason the Union was kept going was that Scotland was doing very well out of the empire. Scots served in virtually every corner of the empire. I remember growing up in Lahore, and there was a corner in the city known as Scotch Corner. And I said, why is it called the Scotch Corner? And they said, it's better you don't know. So I haven't found out to this day what actually happened there. But anyway, so it's not the case that there's an automatic sympathy for fellow workers or fellow oppressed within the European working class. This has never been the case. The position of the French Communist Party on both Vietnam and Algeria as the largest working class party was pretty pathetic, to put it mildly. And the same, you can extend the same to most parts of Europe where there were empires. In the Belgians, they were not at all. The Belgian workers, both Walloons and the Flemish, were not at all sympathetic to the African workers or the African peasants or the African plantation workers who were being used. So it's a combination of empire, and it's a well-known fact now, which has been pushed even further, that slavery played its part in that. The fact you could buy and sell black people in the open market, not keep them in Britain, it has to be said, but used in the Caribbean, other parts of British colonies, and by the United States everywhere, and by the Brazilian elite in Brazil. In Brazil, there were probably more slave rebellions than elsewhere. All this went quite deep in the consciousness of the working class at the height of empire. Since the empire has ended, I would like to say this really and stress this. The fact that over 1 million people have died in Iraq, at least 250,000 in Libya, God knows how many in Syria. Does it have any big impact on ordinary people sleepwalking through the streets of Europe? Yeah, we had huge demonstrations. But by and large, people say, oh, well, we can't do anything about it. They don't like to think about it. not to mention what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians today. So I'm very allergic to saying racism is a class issue. Well, you can say it should be. I would support that, but it isn't. And it has never been. Except now in the United States, because a lot of trade union leaders in various fields are actually people who are non-white, it is having a bigger impact there than it is in Europe so far. So we will see. This is why it's quite interesting, but the movements in the United States have had an impact. I mean, even the demand that the police should be dismantled. I mean, and some local councils voting for it did take me aback. I said, my God, something's happened. If this is what is taking place in the United States, I mean, in Britain, any thought of defunding the police is just anathema to either the Tories or the Labour Party. So empire has played its part, and the wars of this century are playing their part in actually creating a feeling that, you know, Arab lives don't matter, Palestinian lives don't matter, Somalian lives don't matter. Anywhere that is regarded as an enemy, so-called enemy of the West, which the West decides, then their lives are not the same as ours. I mean, you just see that in the Iraq War, all the warmonger countries who went to war decided, Britain included, by the way, that they would not even count the casualties of Iraqis. Not even count the numbers of Iraqis killed, because it wasn't their business. Who was going to count them then? And had it not been for independent people, like groups of medical experts from Baltimore, John Hopkins in Baltimore, Lancet, the magazine, health magazine in this country, we wouldn't even have got an estimate. I think the estimates are low because many, many more people were killed. But so whatever happens, and, you know, mass unemployment, if it comes, and the government can't keep the figures down. I mean, it's happening now. Lots of people are not being able to get jobs back, and this will carry on. I'm afraid the way it will be used is there will be a lot of racism involved in that. There's no point in being idealistic about it. The question is how to fight it. And this has been a sort of permanent question. I mean, I remember speaking at strikes where the workers were on strike because the white shop stewards, the Imperial typewriter strike in Leicester, the white shop stewards were telling the company that they would walk out if the Asian workers belonging to the Indian Workers Association were allowed to join the union. That's the degree of it. And it wasn't the only one which did it. So, you know, we have to be careful about this. And the other thing which is, you know, becoming quite a common discussion on American campuses, which I don't like at all, is this notion of racial capitalism. Capitalism has always been divisive. It never unites anyone. So against women, against others, against the poorer sections, the white working class itself, it divides. It sees the best way to maximize profits. And just discovering its racial capitalism when you have had the whole history, slavery and empire behind you, is, I mean, it's just not credible. It's a fashion on the campus, saying if we identify it as such, it might help. Well, I don't think it's accurate, that identification anyway. The implication is that there is a pure capitalism, which is non-racial or non-sexist, or which helps the poorer workers in the in workplaces today. That's just nonsense. I think I've dealt with the question.
Thank you so much, Tariq, for your answers there and for being so comprehensive on that group of questions. I'm sure everyone really appreciates the depth that you gave to that section. So we're now at 25 past 7.
Okay.
We have one group of questions left on everyone on the Scottish left in particular's favourite topic, which is the European Union. And what I'm going to do is there's only 2 questions in this grouping. So I'll ask these questions that have come in from supporters of Conter, and then if you just make some closing remarks at that same time, and then once you're done, I can wrap it up and tell everyone about what's coming up in the Conter. So we all love talking about the European Union still. I do agree with your earlier comments about the campaign for a second referendum was a complete disaster. I think that was a really, I think it just showed some real intellectual and ideological weaknesses in the left. But I'm sure there's plenty of people on the Zoom call that would disagree with that position. So the first question that we have has come from Margaret. It was submitted through our WhatsApp group, and she says, post-COVID, and perhaps in relation to the EU's appalling approach to fighting the virus, post-COVID, do you think the left across Europe might start to take a more critical stance towards the European Union, particularly in view of the increasing militarization of that organisation? And the second question here is, Tariq, it quotes you, right? So someone has quoted something you've said, and it's in the question. So I don't know if you did say this or this is a paraphrase or whatever, but the question is from Mike, and he says, in the 2016 Brexit referendum, you said, quote, I believe a tactical vote to get out of the EU would benefit all and could permit even a mildly radical Labour government to carry out its policies. How do you think that has panned out, and what are your thoughts on the democratic implications for a radical democratic independence movement of the vote to oppose Tory Brexit in Scotland of over 60%? So that's our 2 questions on the EU. I'll hand that over to you to answer and to make your concluding remarks. So there you go.
Well, thank you, yeah. Is there within the European Union a unified left which is opposing most of the union's atrocities and the selfishness of some of its wealthier countries? I wouldn't say that there's a huge movement, but there is a group of people, I don't always agree with them, which go by the name of DM, which want to democratize the European Union, led by one of their central leaders is the former Greek finance minister, Varoufakis, who worked with the Europeans firsthand when they decided to crush Greece and later Spain. So there is a movement of sorts, but as I always ask them, who is going to implement these reforms? Because it is inconceivable that we will have a mildly radical social democratic government in 4 or 5 European countries at the same time. Let's say Germany, France, Italy, Spain, whatever. It's very unlikely. And so it's going to be difficult, I think, to do it from within. What we do need is a mass movement from below, which challenges, which at least puts pressure on the political classes. And have no doubt that the EU is deeply unpopular in a number of countries, you know, both on the left and the right. I mean, the French actually voted against that constitution, the Maastricht Treaty. We shouldn't forget that. And the way they did it was by going to every city and village and organizing public meetings, explaining what was in the constitution, which even the politicians couldn't do, and telling people why it would be bad if Europe accepted this particular constitution, which is now, you know, effectively being enforced. These referendums were ignored. The Irish were made to vote twice on something else, and they tried very hard to push Britain to deny the referendum that had already taken place. So the fight to democratize Europe is part and parcel of the fight to democratize the non-European countries, the non-EU countries, as well as, it's something that I've been arguing in the extreme center for a long time. I don't think Europe needs to be fetishized. I think Scotland got caught up in this in that way, because anything to get away from England. And the one thing people could cling to at that time and see it was the European Union. I understand that. I don't sort of deny that if you're going to leave the United Kingdom, are you going to be on your own? And the only thing I said during that campaign to friends in Scotland is, look at, the choices for Scotland are limited. Do you want to become like the Irish Republic with an extremely weak welfare system and basically doing the EU's bidding in the most craven way possible? Even in terms of giving, I remember there was some proposal in the Irish Republic of giving a grant, teeny amount of money it involved, to cultural organizations in the Irish Republic. And the Prime Minister who was at the meeting at the cabinet said, oh, we better clear it with Europe first. So, if you're going to become EU colonies, then at least know what you're going into. My view is that Scotland inside the EU would give up one master for another. That's what would happen. It's not big enough to have any real position in the EU, and if the Spanish do not veto it going in, Catalonia will really erupt. So there are lots and lots of problems. So if you think of what has happened to the EU over the last 20, 25 years, it's been, criticized and analyzed by many on the left. Whether to stay in or go out, for me, is not a big issue of principle. It's a tactical decision that you make. The quote from me is perfectly accurate. After what the EU had done to Greece in particular, forced its leaders to stamp on a referendum which wanted them to cease negotiations with the Troika. After the way they treated Spain, I felt it was good if the EU got a big kick in its tender paths from at least one country. And that country happened to be Britain. The entire establishment here was convinced they were going to win the referendum. Everyone. From Cameron, via the Liberals, via a big majority of the Labour Party, the SNP, they were convinced Britain would never vote this way. And then it did. And then immediately the charges were it's because British workers are racist. Well, they may be mildly infected, but that's not the main reason they voted against the EU. It's because they knew everything that had been done in this country was with the agreement of the EU. They knew the pressures that were coming. I voted because we were hoping a Corbyn government might come into action and would be crushed, actually, by the EU. So it was good to be out. As I said, it was a tactical decision. I mean, we got it wrong in terms of Corbyn because, no one predicted the scale of the campaign, but it's very clearly, even that campaign is linked to the EU, and Labour's decision to back a second referendum was a disaster. So these are questions which we'll be carrying on debating, but I would like to say to friends in Scotland, or even enemies in Scotland, think very carefully before you jump onto the EU bandwagon. If Scotland becomes independent, it might be better to continue as an independent state for some time before making this, flying and leaping into the arms of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Tariq. I'm sure it'll come to no surprise to anyone who has listened to the Contercast podcast or read anything that I've written recently about the European Union. I do agree with that view, particularly when it comes to Scotland. I know plenty of people in Scotland, pro-independence people, socialists who are very critical of the European Union, who voted to remain in Europe because they saw Brussels as possibly some kind of buffer against the extreme Tory government. But I also, really worry about, the future for the independence movement when the current leadership of the SNP tell us that they want independence, but want to give away economic policy to the Bank of England, our social policy to the European Union, and our foreign policy to NATO.
Yeah.
I think that these are big questions for the left in Scotland, but these questions about sovereignty and power are questions for the left everywhere. So I'll bring the evening to a close just with some pointers about what's coming up, and again to emphasise that appeal that Jonathan Shafi made for donations. I've really enjoyed tonight. I'm getting a lot of messages from people to say they've really enjoyed your contribution, Tariq. I want to thank you very much on behalf of the Conter organising team and the editorial board. Again, if everyone could join me in that virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for your contribution tonight. So just before we log off and get on with our evenings, I want to just say to people that you can visit conter.co.uk. There you'll be able to read that piece that people have mentioned, George Kerrivan's latest article, and you'll be able to find out about upcoming events, including a memorial to the Scottish Marxist Neil Davidson, who was a real pioneering intellect and a huge influence on my politics and the politics of the Radical Independence Campaign. There's a memorial and a celebration of Neil's life and contribution coming up tomorrow night, and the details of that are on the Conter website. We're sponsoring that with a number of other organisations. You'll also be able to find out more about the work that we're doing, and also that very important donate page. So please do donate. The events that we have coming up over summer, we're running a summer school on Marxism that will teach people in the core building blocks of historical materialism. We have sessions on Marxism and racism and imperialism and the nature of the state, and real theoretical groundings for people who are interested in these ideas. So I'm just going to thank everyone again for coming. An email will go out after this meeting with more information, and again the link to the WhatsApp group to bring you together with like-minded people. Just join that. Thank you, everyone, for coming along tonight, and thank you for your support during this lecture series that's been going on for the last few weeks. I'm going to leave it there, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you again, Tariq, and good night.